Here we have a list of recipes. What if we wanted to print out each item in every single recipe so that if we need to go grocery shopping, we can get all of the items? Well, we're going to use a nested for loop. And this is what a nested for loop looks like. It has a for loop inside of a for loop. So we have this for some outer variable in some sequence. Inside of that is going to be another for loop for some inner variable in some other sequence. And then we're going to execute some code using both the outer and inner variables. So let's say we have a board, which is a 2D list, lists inside of a list. The outer for loop is going to go through each row, and the inner for loop is going to go through every column. So let's see how this works. We have the board from the slide before, and we have a nested for loop. So when the for loop starts first, it's going to do for row in range 0 to length of the board. What is the length of the board? Well, board has 3 items inside of it, so the length of board is going to be 3. So the first number in our range is going to be 0. So the variable row is going to contain the value 0. Now we're going to go inside of that for loop, and we see another for loop. For call in range 0, length of board of row. Well, what is board of row? Row is our variable from the outer for loop, and it currently contains the value of 0. So what is the item at index 0 inside of board? Well, it's going to be this first list. What is the length of this list? It's going to be 2. So our range in our inner for loop is going to go from 0 to 2. So since we are just starting this for loop, what is the first number that is going to be? It's going to be 0. So call, our variable, is going to have the value of 0. So then we go inside of that for loop and we print out board of row call. So what is board of row? Well, we said before that the variable row has the value of 0. So the item at index 0 in board is this list 2, 3 circled in green. So from there, we need to get the 0th item, which is the value of call, so that it can print it out. So what is the 0th item in this list? It's going to be 2, so 2 gets printed out. Alright, then we're going to go back to our for loop. We're going to do the inner for loop because it's not done yet. So what is the next item in our range? Well, we just did 0, and we said the length of board row is going to be 2 since there are 2 items in this list. So our range is going to go from 0 to 2. So the next value of call is going to be 1. So with that, we're going to go inside of that for loop again and print board row call. So again, board of row is this list that's circled in green, and the value of call is now 1. So we're going to get the item at index 1 in board row, which is this list 2, 3. So what is the item at index 1 in this list? It's going to be 3, so that gets printed out. We then go to the for loop, and we see that there's nothing left in our range. Again, our range was going to go from 0 to 2, and when we do a range of that, 2 is not included. So we're done with this range. So now we're done with this for loop. So we return back to the outer for loop. So we had row was equal to 0. So we're going to move on forward with our range here as well. So range for row is going to be 0 through 3 because the length of board is 3 as we established earlier. So now row is going to be 1. We go inside that for loop and we have for call in range 0 to length of board of row. So what is board of row now? We are going to get the item at index 1 inside of board, so it's going to be this list. Now, call is going to be the range of 0 to this length of this list, which is 2. So it's going to go from range 0 until 2. So now call is going to be 0 again. So then we go inside of this for loop and do print board of row call. So board of row is this list that we have circled, and the item at index 0, which is the value of call, is going to be 7. So 7 gets printed out. We then go back to this for loop, and we see that we have another item in our sequence, so call is now going to be 1. We go back inside that for loop, and we print out board of row call. So now we're going to get the item at index 1 inside of this list circled in green. So now it's going to be 2. We go back to the for loop, and we see that we've reached the end of the range. So we are done with this inner for loop, so we go back to the outer for loop. We saw that row has the current value of 1, and so the next item in that sequence is going to be 2. So now row has the value of 2. We go back into the for loop, and we do call a range of 0 length of board of row again. So what is board of row now? Well, row has the value of 2, so we're going to get the item at index 2 inside of board. What is that going to be? It's going to be this last list, 8, 5. So now call is going to have the number 0 because we're going from range to 2. We go inside of the for loop and we print board row call. So board of row again is this list, 8, 5. The item at index 0 is going to be 8, so we print that out. We then go back to the inner for loop and we see what number is going to be next in our range. So now call is going to be 1. So then we go inside of this for loop and print board of row, which is again this list that is circled, and we get the item at index 1, which is now going to be 5. So now we go back to our inner for loop and we're done with the range because there's nothing left. And so now we go back to the outer for loop and we also see that there is nothing left in that range. So at this time, we are done with our for loop.